You really have to picture this to understand the sheer insanity of the situation. Imagine a pristine, rolling valley that has remained virtually untouched since the late 1800s, a place where the air smells like sweet clover and wet earth. And then imagine dropping 135 identical, soulless McMansions right in the middle of it like a concrete tumor, completely swallowing one lone, defiant farmhouse that refuses to die. That farmhouse belongs to me. I'm Elias Thorne, and I watched from my front porch as a woman named Victoria Sterling stepped out of her pearl-white luxury SUV, her designer heels immediately sinking into the muck of my cattle yard with a squelch that sounded suspiciously like justice. And she had the audacity to wave an eviction notice at me on land that my family has bled for since President McKinley was in office. She looked around with this expression of supreme disgust, wrinkling her nose at the smell of honest work and wet hay, telling me that this was a family neighborhood now, not some rural eyesore. And as thunder began to rumble overhead, echoing off the valley walls like a warning shot, I rested my hand on the cold brass lever of the dam my grandfather, Silas Thorne, built by hand in 1961. And I realized that these people didn't just want my land, they wanted to erase my entire history. But they had forgotten one very important thing about nature, which is that water always finds its level, and gravity doesn't care about your net worth. Let me rewind a bit so you understand the stakes here, because this wasn't just about dirt and grass. This was about 850 acres in Oakhaven Valley that has been the Thorne legacy for 4 generations, a place defined by a massive ancient oak tree and a watershed system fed by underground springs so pure that my late wife, Martha, used to say the water tasted like starlight. Martha wasn't just the love of my life for 26 years. She was a brilliant environmental scientist who spent her entire academic career studying this specific watershed, documenting the flood patterns and the delicate balance of the ecosystem. And when I lost her to cancer 18 months ago, leaving me with a hole in my heart and $130,000 in medical debt, this land became the only physical connection I had left to her. Our daughter, Sophie, who's a software engineer up in Portland, kept begging me to sell, telling me it was just property, but she didn't understand that selling would feel like deleting the last voicemail Martha ever left me. It was unthinkable. Everything went sideways 2 years ago when my neighbor, Old Man Miller, passed away and his kids sold 640 prime acres to a corporate giant called Summit Horizon Group for over $3 million. And these vultures immediately turned their hungry eyes toward me, offering me a payout that they thought a grieving widower would snatch up in a heartbeat. But when I told them politely to go kick rocks, they didn't just take no for an answer, they started a war. Within 3 months, their surveyors had accidentally shifted the boundary lines 200 feet onto my property, and by the time I caught on to the scam, the construction crews for Sterling Heights were already pouring concrete. And the most criminal part was that they built their main entrance, their gaudy clubhouse, and their playground entirely on my soil, stealing my spring water to mix their cement without paying a single dime. It was theft, plain and simple, executed with the confidence of people who are used to getting away with murder, but the real slap in the face came when Victoria Sterling, the self-appointed queen of the HOA and wife to City Councilman Richard Sterling, rolled up to my fence line to lecture me about community standards. She stood there, surrounded by the artificial scent of expensive perfume that was trying and failing to mask the smell of the diesel fumes from the illegal bulldozers. And she handed me a binder of HOA bylaws I had never signed, telling me that my barn, a structure that has stood since the Korean War, was aesthetically displeasing and didn't align with the visual harmony of Sterling Heights. I was holding a pair of fence pliers, staring at this woman who was standing on dirt my great-grandfather homesteaded. And even my rooster, General Patton, seemed offended, puffing up his chest and strutting toward her like he was ready to peck a hole in her Louis Vuitton bag. When I told her that my family had been setting the standard in this valley before her subdivision was even a sketch on a napkin, her smile turned into something cold and reptilian, and she said, "That is exactly the problem we are here to correct." And that night, as I sat on the porch listening to the coyotes howl, I realized they weren't just bad neighbors. They were invaders. The harassment campaign started the very next morning. My mailbox was stuffed so full of violation notices it looked like it was going to explode, citing me for things like livestock odor, unsightly agricultural equipment, and my personal favorite, fence height violations. hitting me with potential fines of over $20,000 a day. They sent a county inspector, a poor guy named Inspector Davis who looked like he hadn't slept in a week, to measure every inch of my property, while General Patton followed him around pecking at his ankles. And Davis admitted quietly that Victoria Sterling was demanding documentation down to the quarter inch, basically trying to bankrupt me through bureaucracy, so I'd be forced to sell. I knew I couldn't fight this alone, so I hired Arthur Pendergast, an ex-military lawyer who looked like he ate bricks for breakfast, and when he looked at the survey maps, he started grinning like a wolf who just found an unlocked sheep pen. Arthur explained something called prescriptive easement, which basically meant that because my family had used that disputed strip of land for over a century, we owned it regardless of what some crooked surveyor said. But then we found the smoking gun using ground-penetrating radar. My grandfather's original concrete boundary markers were buried directly underneath the foundation of Victoria's precious community center. They had built their headquarters on my land, which made every HOA meeting a criminal trespass. But Victoria was faster than a striking cobra, and before we could file the injunction, she pulled strings with her husband's connections to get my barn red-tagged as structurally unsafe, giving me 24 hours to evacuate my cattle or face criminal charges. We raced to the courthouse and filed a massive federal lawsuit for civil rights violations and racketeering just minutes before closing, but the retaliation turned dangerous almost immediately, with anonymous calls to animal control claiming my cows were diseased, and then I found fresh tire tracks in my pasture and a calf, one of my favorites, dead from a cut wire fence. That was the moment the sadness turned into cold, hard rage, and I called Sophie under the light of the moon, telling her that I wasn't just defending dirt anymore. I was proving that a regular person could still stand up to corruption, and she told me to win, but not to fight alone. The war for Oakhaven Valley escalated into something that felt less like a legal dispute and more like a siege, and 3 days after we dropped that federal lawsuit, Victoria Sterling decided to rally her troops by calling an emergency safety meeting at the clubhouse, the very same clubhouse that was sitting illegally on my property, effectively using my own land to organize a lynch mob against me. I watched through my binoculars as 89 terrified homeowners packed into that room, listening to Victoria spin a narrative where I was the villain, using photos of my cattle to claim they were disease vectors and painting General Patton as some kind of aggressive wildlife threat that was lowering their property values by thousands of dollars. She was petitioning the city council for emergency eminent domain to seize my ranch, claiming it was a public health hazard, so Arthur and I decided to crash the party, walking in uninvited carrying a briefcase full of federal documents, and, more importantly, Martha's original environmental research from 1994. The room went dead silent, the kind of silence you hear right before a tornado touches down, and I introduced myself, not as the crazy old rancher, but as the custodian of the watershed, while Arthur laid out the cards on the table, revealing that Summit Horizon Group had received over $3 million in federal grants to protect the wetlands, but instead, they had used that taxpayer money to drain them and build houses in a federally protected flood zone. You could see the color drain from the faces of the residents, people like Eleanor Vance, a retired science teacher, and SGT. Major Briggs, an Army vet, who realized that if what we were saying was true, their flood insurance was void and they were sitting on a ticking time bomb. Victoria tried to dismiss it as bureaucratic nonsense, but Eleanor stood up, her voice shaking with rage, asking if they had really been harassing the man whose dam had been keeping their basements dry for decades. And suddenly the room turned, the perfect suburban facade cracking as residents realized the villain wasn't the guy with the cows. It was the woman in the designer heels who had lied to them to sell houses. But Victoria wasn't done. She decided to hit me where it hurts the most, digging through public records to find the crushing medical debt from Martha's cancer treatments. And she coordinated with Summit Horizon to file fraudulent mechanics liens against my property, claiming they had improved my drainage and billing me $89,000 for work I never asked for on land they had stolen. Arthur called it quantum meruit, abuse, basically legal extortion, but the stress was physically killing me, sending me to the ER with chest pains that felt like a heart attack, where Dr. Emily Clark told me my blood pressure was high enough to power a small city, and that this war was literally going to put me in the grave next to my wife. Sophie flew down, terrified, begging me to let it go, But that night, while going through Martha's old boxes, I found her master's thesis, and inside was a handwritten note in the margin that stopped my heart cold. Natural floodplain extends 2.3 miles downstream during 50-year storm events. Development here without upstream agricultural retention would be catastrophic. My brilliant wife had predicted this entire nightmare 28 years ago, and she had given me the blueprint to end it, because legally, under riparian water rights, as long as I was using the water for agricultural purposes, I had absolute control over the flow, and downstream owners had zero claim to flood protection they never paid for. We formed a war council in my kitchen with Eleanor, Sergeant Major Briggs, and a sharp engineer named Lisa Zhang. And when they saw Martha's calculations, they realized the terrifying truth. The dam my grandfather built was the only thing stopping nature from reclaiming the entire subdivision. Lisa ran the models and confirmed that if I simply opened the gates and let the water flow naturally, the entire development would be under 3 feet of water within 48 hours. Not a flash flood, but a slow, unstoppable rise that would make the homes uninhabitable. Victoria must have sensed the tide turning because she went full scorched earth, calling in favors to get Child Protective Services to investigate me. I don't even have young kids, and even trying to get me 5150D, involuntarily committed to a psych ward, by claiming my grief gardening was a sign of mental instability. A move that backfired spectacularly when the sheriff and the doctor realized I was perfectly sane and she was the one with the control complex. But the final straw, the move that sealed her fate, was when she convinced a judge to sign a temporary restraining order prohibiting me from altering water systems, effectively trying to legally bind my hands just as the National Weather Service issued a warning for the biggest storm system in 3 years. It was biblical timing, the kind of coincidence that makes you believe in ghosts, because just as the restraining order arrived, federal marshals showed up to raid the offices of Summit Horizon thanks to the evidence we provided. An investigative reporter, Rachel Hayes, dropped a bombshell article exposing the corruption ring involving Victoria's husband. The clouds gathered over the valley like a dark bruise, heavy and swollen with rain, and Victoria, desperate and cornered, called another emergency meeting at the clubhouse for Saturday afternoon, ignoring the weather warnings, trying to spin a narrative of environmental terrorism to frighten the residents back into submission. I stood at the window watching the rain start to fall, realizing that I had exactly 45 minutes to make the hardest decision of my life. Do I keep protecting the people who tried to destroy me? Or do I step aside and let nature deliver the verdict that the courts were taking too long to hand down? The storm wasn't just weather anymore. It was a reckoning. And I put on my grandfather's hat, grabbed the brass keys to the dam, and walked out into the rain, knowing that whatever happened next, Oakhaven Valley would never be the same. The rain wasn't just falling. It was being driven into the earth with the fury of 1,000 scorned ancestors, turning the sky a bruised purple as I stood by the manual controls of the dam, the brass levers worn smooth by the hands of Silas Thorne. Down below, inside the illegally built clubhouse, Victoria Sterling was screaming over the sound of the storm, accusing me of manipulating the weather like some kind of rural sorcerer. But the truth was far simpler and far more devastating. I was just about to stop doing the favor I'd never been thanked for. With Sergeant Major Briggs monitoring the flow rates and Lisa Zhang running real-time hydration models, I began to turn the wheel, not all at once, but slowly, methodically, initiating a controlled release that mimicked exactly what the natural water table would do if no humans were present. The water didn't roar like a movie monster. It hissed, a steady, relentless creeping force that bypassed the artificial drainage ditches Summit Horizon had installed and sought out the ancient paths Martha had mapped decades ago, paths that ran directly through the living rooms of the luxury estates. Panic broke out in the clubhouse not because of a tsunami, but because the fire alarm started shrieking as water seeped into the electrical grid, and within an hour, the perfect community was ankle-deep in muddy reality. Rachel Hayes was broadcasting live, capturing the image of Victoria standing in the rising floodwaters, shrieking about property values while the sheriff, who had just arrived, told her to call her lawyer because I wasn't breaking a single law. I was simply engaging in legal agricultural water management on my own property. The visual was poetic justice in its purest form. The multi-million-dollar homes were slowly becoming expensive aquariums, while my farmhouse, built by men who understood the land rather than sought to exploit it, sat high and dry on the hill, the American flag snapping in the wind. Victoria's husband, Richard, tried to flee the country but was arrested at the airport with a suitcase full of cash, and Victoria herself was led away in handcuffs, still ranting, as the residents she had manipulated watched from the high ground, realizing that the crazy farmer had been their protector all along. When a reporter shoved a microphone in my face, asking if I felt guilty for destroying the community, I looked into the lens, water dripping from the brim of my hat, and said, "I didn't destroy anything, son. I just stopped preventing nature from fixing a mistake." The aftermath was swift and absolute. The insurance companies, realizing the fraud regarding the flood zones, settled for nearly $50 million, allowing the residents to be made whole, and Summit Horizon was liquidated, their executives facing federal prison time for environmental fraud. In the months that followed, the valley transformed. Half the residents took their payouts and left, but the ones who stayed, good people like Eleanor, Briggs, and Lisa, helped me tear down the ruined McMansions and return the land to the wild. We used the settlement money and federal grants to establish the Martha Thorne Memorial Wetlands, a nature preserve that acts as a natural flood control system for the entire county. Life has a funny way of balancing the books. My health recovered the moment the stress lifted. Sophie moved back home to run the science center we built, and Eleanor, well, she moved into the farmhouse with me, bringing a warmth back to those rooms that I thought was gone forever. General Patton still patrols the grounds, wearing a little conservation badge Lisa made for him, strutting around like he personally ordered the flood. We sit on the porch now, watching the sun set over a valley teeming with birds that haven't been seen here in 30 years, and I think about how Martha was right all along. Nature always wins in the end. We just have to be smart enough to get out of the way. But it leaves you with a question that keeps me up sometimes. When the law fails and corruption takes over, is it justice to let the innocent suffer collateral damage to stop the guilty? Or is letting nature take its course just a convenient excuse for revenge? I know my answer, but I wonder what you would have done standing at that wheel in the pouring rain.